as we know, there's some real challenges. So this session here is gearing towards what should be in the FIT review. We've got some real challenges pending. I mean, for many of you in the room, this is no surprise. We haven't seen any FIT announcements since last December. We know that the FIT review is out, and the opportunity is there to comment till December 14th, but we really have no idea when we're going to see any of the findings from the FIT review. So there's some real serious concerns, too, about how much product's going to be in the pipeline, how much employment's going to be there, are there going to be projects for people to sell customers, projects for manufacturers to put product in their hands, or is there going to be some gaps? And I think we have to be very cognizant of that as we go through. Now, let's face it, Ontario's not the only place that there's some gyrations on the FIT front. I was talking to some people from the UK on the weekend, and there was some pretty big changes to their, which is equivalent, I guess, to the microfit program over there. Unless you have your rooftop project installed by December 12th, you're not going to get paid. Also, it looks like they're going to have new changes where the buildings that the solar rooftop stuff is put on have to meet some fairly strict energy efficiency standard, which is an interesting idea. And we've already seen the fact that there are the FIT price for solar there has been cut in half. And it's interesting that there's also some legal challenges being put forward. One of them, in fact, by the Friends of the Earth UK on these changes. So what I'm going to put to each of the panelists here is a question: what are the most important issues or items in the FIT review that the FIT review needs to address? We're going to go across the panel and ask this question. I reserve the right for some supplementaries, but I do hope that we also have a chance to get some questions off the floor. Now, I'm going to do a really quick overview of who's at the front of the room, though they're all well known to you. Jason Chialoy was the Director of Generation Procurement at the Ontario Power Authority from August 2005 to August 2010. And as you know, he's now at Power Advisory and is providing important counsel to people across the industry. So we look forward to what his views are on what the FIT review should have in it. Marion, of course, is extremely well known on the policy work that she's done. Some people don't know that she was at Enbridge before she was at Queen's Park. She was one of the first people providing policy advice into the Minister of Environment in the new Liberal government. I think that she was responsible for laying a pretty solid foundation which took us into the Green Energy Act, the Feed-in Tariff Act. So her comments will be pretty important in terms of the time period that she can speak to and the reference. Byron Leclerc brings an interesting perspective too, because he oversees a very successful series of First Nations-owned projects, energy generation projects. I always think of Pick River as being a water power source, or as a water power strength, but he reminds me that they do have some wind stuff going on, and their most recent success is the Mbata Falls project. And he's going to be able to tell us whether or not, what parts of the FIT review should consider, what elements of the First Nations interest should be considered in the FIT review. And now John Spears is a business reporter who I've known since the mid-1990s when we were both at Metro Hall for a while. And though you may not always agree with John, and other people may not agree with this statement, but he's seldom wrong. Always good, solid reporting, and always worth reading. And Joe Mulhall is of the Canadian Union of Skilled Workers, and he's going to give us a perspective on what has to be considered for labor and his members and similar people on helping to build a sustainable economic future here in Ontario, again within the FIT context. Now, Jason, do you want, now, so I'm going to put the question to everybody again. We'll do a quick run through, and then we'll open it up for supplementary. So what are the most important issues or items the FIT review needs to address. This is for December 14th.
Over to me. Thank you, Don. So I'm going to just list three things at a pretty high level, and I think in this order. I think the first thing with respect to the FIT review, when you walk back and you think about the goals of the Green Energy Act and the goals of the feed-in tariff program, resulting in over 20,000 megawatts of applications, to which 4,700 megawatts or so, under 5,000, are under FIT and microfit contracts. That's a massive, massive amount of generation. And that generation needs to be integrated in our power system, in our communities, in our economy over the next year to 3 years. So I think this review has to be very sensitive to really understanding what's working and what's not working from a practical point of view. It's safe to say that I think Colin had remarked that the feed-in tariff program in Ontario was the most, and is still the most, comprehensive standard offer feed-in tariff program in North America. So we didn't really have the luxury of understanding how to do this from the standpoint of doing it in North America. So we looked at Europe, but the European markets, the European power system are a little different to here. So we did the best we can as a province. Now we have to integrate all this stuff. So I think practical questions need to be answered. The second thing that I'll raise that I think this review needs to consider is balance and flexibility. And when I talk about balance, I'm talking about, one, meeting the government's policy objectives by way of the Green Energy and Green Economy Act as embodied in the feed-in tariff program regarding the renewable projects that leads to manufacturing, that then leads to green jobs. But that's sort of one leg of a three-legged stool. The second leg would be, again, as I said first, you have to integrate all this generation in a power system, and a power system is pretty complicated. Electrons flow where they want to flow given the paths of least resistance. It's a pretty complicated sector that has to always maintain reliability and a certain quality of service for all customers. And that leads to the third point with respect to balancing and flexibility, and that deals with economics. And there's two sides to the economic coin. The economics with respect to developers under feed-in tariff contracts that have projects, they're moving them forward, and those economics working for the developer to see those projects meet their contracted commercial operation date. But I think we all have to remember that on the other side of that coin, ratepayers have to pay for all of this. And it's not just renewables, it's everything in the power system. I suggest that over the last 20 years or so, 30 years in fact, we haven't really seen the level of infrastructure investment that we needed in a timely manner decades ago, and now we're playing catch up. So there's a lot of things hitting bills of consumers all at once. And the third thing, to cap it all off and to tie it all together, we really need stability in this program, and that equals and leads to stability for me. Let's not lose sight that it is a procurement program. It's a standard offer procurement program. That's a fine process for specific projects, and we want to make sure if we're serious about greening our economy, cleaning up our environment, and increasing the penetration of renewable generation projects, we have to try to avoid as best we can the booms and busts with respect to, a bull market to really run to do these projects, and all of a sudden we have a bear market a couple years later. So we have to find a way to create some stability, and that equals sustainability.
Thanks, Jason. Marion.
Thank you, Don. Pleased to be here today and have the opportunity to speak with you about, what I guess is one of my favorite topics, because I keep coming back to it over and over again, and I've just written a recent paper called The Green Energy Act, Getting It Right, Not Quite. If anyone wants a copy, you can just give me an email and I'll send it to you. I think there's two things that I would like to point out with respect to the FIT review. And we always have to remember that the Green Energy Act is not just about FIT, it's about a whole bunch of other things. And all those other things have to become teed up and lined up as well. Smart grid, conservation, the role of First Nations, the role of communities, and so on and so forth. But there were a lot of things in the ask by the Green Energy Act that did not materialize in the FIT program per se. Things like including a standard offer for things like solar thermal and geothermal and storage, and a broader array of efforts. We also asked for price digression, which would have obviated the need for the kind of stop-start stuff that happened last summer with respect to this, oh my God, look at all of these ground mount solar things that are going up as a microfit. And quite frankly, when I drive by a farm in Bruce County and I see one of those arrays, and I think that farmer is lucky. He's going to have actually cash flow on a regular basis that he can predict over the next 20 years. And if any of you have ever farmed, you know that cash flow that's predictable is not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. So I think the review process needs to go back and look at some of the things that we asked for originally, and to see where those pieces could have helped us, even in terms of the effort. For instance, digression tied to the rate of applications could have certainly helped. The other thing that I think is important to note, that the government has maintained management and decision-making with respect to the feed-in tariff process, because the feed-in tariff process is not just an OPA program. The biggest barrier, as most of us in the room know here, is the fact that our rural distribution system, primarily owned and operated and not up to date, is really no more than a great bunch of extension cords strung across the province, and it's really hard for those extension cords to do what they need to do. So we need to revamp that. We need to ensure that the right technical parameters are ongoing. As a policy advisor to the Minister of Energy, I can't tell you how many times somebody from one of the agencies came in and said, "Oh, Minister, it's much more technical than that. It's much more complex. We can't just do X, Y, or Z." So we have to guard against that because, I think going to the moon was pretty technical. People did that in 10 years. So we're now, actually John Baird, as Minister of Energy back in 2003, asked the Ontario Energy Board to put the right kind of rules in place to make sure that the LDCs were hooking up micro-embedded generators. And yet, we had a Hydro One application to get themselves excused from those rules, which for the first time ever provided some interesting data about the flow of applications beyond what the OPA puts out. And I think all of this information should be transparent, open. You should be able to know where your application stands, whether it's for a connection, whether it's for a contract, exactly the same way that you can figure out where, the Federal Express parcel is. And quite frankly, even the Canada Post can do that now. So if Canada Post can do it, I don't see any reason in the world why a bright, intelligent community like Ontario can't do it. What was also clear in that review was that the field staff of Hydro One had not been told about the different standard of for the higher standard for connection process for micro-embedded cogenerations than they were used to delivering on customer attachments until May of this year. Now, the whole point of micro-embedded generators, for example, and this is just one example, I could go on about all the other rub points, but I'll just use these examples because they're fresh in my mind, that they were not supposed to require a connection impact assessment. However, Hydro One developed a tool which no one in the industry knew about until it was finally published online. But they had been using it, and they actually then automated that tool. So what happened? The rate at which they could turn down applications increased. And so we've got to all get on the same page and pull together in the same direction. And it's not just the OPA, it's the OEB, it's Hydro One, it's LDCs have done, by and large, the other LDCs have done by and large a better job, or at least they certainly don't get the complaints. They don't have the volume. The other thing that was very clear in the Hydro One case on the exemption was that the way in which the OPA batched the applications was so that all of a sudden there was a whole bunch of things to announce. And my guess is that there was a political hand in that as well, not just the OPA's druthers, and so rather than having a steady stream of applications coming into LDCs, including Hydro One, all of a sudden there was an announcement and there were thousands. And stuff literally got lost. The one fellow invested $70,000 of his retirement savings into putting a 10 kilowatt solar array. He was phoning Hydro One weekly, and I know all of you have these stories. And, he built it, and then meanwhile his son, who lived, one farm over, applied 8 months after he did, and he got connected. And then this fellow got told that there was no more capacity on the system. There is just no way in the world that a modern society can live with that kind of paperwork. So we've got to clean our act on those things. Those things are just they're outrageous. And these people have put their life savings into it. So calling them developers is making them sound like they're rich people that have all sorts of corporations with deep pockets. And that's not what we've talked about. That was not what the Green Energy Act was all about. It was about communities, about individuals, First Nations, institutions. I heard from the facility manager at York University that the $17 million cogen plant is not allowed to participate in the OPA's combined heat and power project because of the date. So it literally is going to be stranded. What are we doing when one public agency strands $17 million of investments by another public agency? Those things are crazy, and I'll stop now.
See how brave I am? Interrupting Marion. Now, one of the other projects that Byron's working on, which actually I also have to remind everybody speaking down there to make sure the microphones are in close to them. One of the projects that Byron's working on too is the north-south grid connection. So Marion will be happy that it'll be a much bigger extension cord. Byron?
Thank you, Marion. Thanks.
Thank
you, Marion. She's mentioned First Nations, so she's covered off everything I wanted to speak about this morning. I had to remind myself this morning coming in here that it only seems like yesterday that my career began with the Pick River First Nation and work on the Wawate generating station, but somehow 25 years have passed, and here we are. I want to give you a bit of on-the-ground perspective with respect to the FIT review and some of the things that are important to First Nations, and hopefully, in a very awkward way, some of the things that are important to developers. I find myself behaving depending on what day it is and who I have to meet, either as a First Nation proponent or as a developer. So I get a very flavored perspective. In terms of FIT, I think one of the important aspects of the program as it's been unveiled and delivered throughout the province is the amount of social license that the Aboriginal Adder program has given to the project. If you're developing renewable energy projects throughout the north, one of the key considerations that, certainly from a First Nation point of view, that you should be giving your project is how are you going to be addressing Aboriginal interests? And it seems to me that having the Aboriginal adder provides the First Nations with a foothold, if you will, to support their interest in these projects as owners. So often our history has been, like, I see the disparity within First Nation communities, within comparing them to the mainstream economy. And if we ever want to bring them into the fold of prosperity that I think all Ontarians deserve, programs like the Aboriginal Adder are important for establishing that and maintaining that social license that every developer is going to be required. There's a couple other points that I just wanted to touch on briefly, and like any other person, any other industry that manufactures products, one of the key considerations that you have to give is being able to deliver your product to market. So whether you're a farmer in southwestern Ontario looking to deliver your chicken eggs to the market, you need a truck. So too do developers in the north require access to transmission and distribution. And it seems to me advisable to consider the transmission question that we have, the challenge that we have for generation projects and being able to provide the infrastructure that we need to deliver our product to market. Not doing so, I think, is going to procure a lot of power that simply cannot be built. Interestingly enough, the feed and tariff program, which has the Aboriginal adder, provides that incentive to include First Nations, but there doesn't seem to be an aligning or corresponding approach to transmission. I think that where the investment for transmission is required in the north to enable a lot of the procurement to be to go ahead and deliver power, renewable energy to the southern market, it's going to happen on Crown land. It's going to happen in treaty areas with many Aboriginal communities. I've lived through two significant transmission proposals that looked at connecting Ontario and Manitoba. We were going to buy our power from Manitoba. Both those initiatives fell on their face, and going through the history as to why those projects didn't succeed, the projects were almost doomed to fail from the start. They looked at First Nations as a secondary consideration. They aligned the First Nations as opponents to the projects, and they set themselves up, in my mind, ultimately for failure. If you take a look at the generation projects that have succeeded, where part of the ownership group is First Nations in Ontario, those projects have gone through and have been developed with a great amount of success. The uptake in terms of the FIT program, I think, speaks to that. So we need to find a way to align our transmission, the required investment in transmission, with the Aboriginal interest for ownership. As part of the East-West High Limited Partnership Group, the First Nations from Thunder Bay to Wawa will be for the first time proposing as owners the construction of a project that will add security, hopefully increase transmission and distribution capacity along the North Shore, and at the same time provide First Nations with ownership interest in, for the first time, in a project. But I'm aware that there are no special incentives for First Nations to come to the table and function as owners. So I'd like to see some consideration given to the challenges that we face on the transmission side, the absence of an Aboriginal adder program in terms of transmission as part of the feed and tariff review. The last point that I want to make speaks to the economics of renewable energy projects. I've heard many times, you talk to anybody within government in the Ministry of Energy, the first consideration is always the ratepayer. And it seems to me that we need to reconsider that question. The ratepayer has benefited from the ability for the province to defer current costs to future generations. I mean, in 1998, when they unbundled Ontario Hydro, there was $38.5 billion in accumulated debt. To me, that reflects the past generations. My father, my grandfather, and they didn't pay their bills. I mean, I basically inherited $38.5 billion as a ratepayer. And it seems to me that we're trying to maintain an unsustainable business model in which those prices that were set in the early 80s are expected to go on forever. Yet, the cost of electricity, if you've ever gone through an environmental assessment, as some developers have in the room here, you know that the costs for environmental assessment development have all gone up. We pay 2011 prices for concrete, 2011 prices for all of the inputs that are required to build a station from concept through to operation. So somehow that the ratepayer thinks that they should be paying 1980 prices for a commodity that's priced in 2011 dollars doesn't seem a very realistic approach to procuring and maintaining new electricity. We live in a province where we benefit from continued positive growth, both in population, both in the economy. It seems to me that we need to re-educate the ratepayers in terms of what the cost of turning those lights actually are. I once heard a gentleman say one of the greatest incentives to conservation is in fact the market. So if we truly paid the cost of electricity, we'd probably see a lot more benefits with respect to conservation efforts as well.
Thanks, Byron. You'll all notice that is the longest I've seen John listen to anybody without taking notes, though he was twitching and grabbing for his pen a few times. So, John, the table's yours.
Thanks for asking me here, and I'm glad that we finally got around to talking about ratepayers, because I think Jason alluded to it too, but I think that when we start talking about FIT reviews, that's a perspective that maybe the folks in this room don't think about quite as much, because you tend to be producers rather than consumers. And the idea of paying more for renewable energy is one that I think bears looking at. And there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we just had an election. The Liberals who supported renewable energy were returned to power, albeit with a minority. But if you combine the Liberal and the New Democrat votes, then you do get a majority support. The other thing that I wasn't able to write about for obvious reasons was the most remarkable thing that came out, I thought, during the election was a poll in the Toronto Sun, which asked people what they thought about the Green Energy Act. 50% said they liked it, 25% said it should be extended. So there's obviously broad support for renewable energy. But I think that when the FIT prices are being reviewed and the people in this room are bringing their case about what kind of price mechanism is required to move power to markets, you do have to think of the consumer's perspective. They don't mind paying higher prices, but they're going to ask you, why am I paying higher prices? And why am I paying higher prices to you? And who am I paying those prices to? And I think that in an unstable minority legislature is going to be a very, very interesting question, because the way the Liberals have set things up, a lot of the renewable projects in Ontario are being run by very big companies. There's Enbridge, Suncor, Samsung, TransAlta. And I think people legitimately are scratching their heads and saying, well, why should I pay higher prices to those big guys? On the other hand, and I'm blue skying here, don't hold me about this being New Democratic Party policy, but they seem to be going hard back on the public power route, which could be that they're in favor of recreating Ontario Hydro. And if you ask people, well, do I want to pay higher rates to Ontario Hydro? I don't know if they're so sympathetic about that either. So I think these are some questions that are answerable and are addressable. But I think the segment of the market that is probably represented at this conference needs to raise its profile a little bit and talk about why higher prices and what kinds of who benefits from them. So I think that's all I have to say.
Thanks, John. And Joe, you've got the enviable position of being at the end of the panel to wind things up, but you also have an enormous responsibility in making sure that the people that are going to be manufacturing and the people that are going to be working for these manufacturers and providing the skilled services are there and able to perform what's required.
That's a good introduction. The last 50 years or so has been a structured workforce around the energy sector in the province of Ontario that we've all come to know as having certain characteristics, and those characteristics are reinforced by many people in the industry. As we've started to move forward into a shift to sustainable energy, there's also been a very first part of a shift to a sustainable energy workforce. And that shift is something that we need to really understand in terms of how we're going to develop the workforce that's going to be needed as we go forward. And it comes in several components. One of those components is that we have a current workforce that are engaged in working in an industry that's well established, well understood, that's based around large manufacturing type generating facilities that are pushing power out to an end user. The whole idea of where we're going with the smart grid and smart energy are heading in a completely opposite direction. The kinds of skills that workforce needs are very different than the ones that are there today. And if we're going to ask people to participate, to go out and make a commitment to actually re-educating themselves, to retraining themselves, to moving forward to participate in making a new industry a success, we have to give them some opportunity to understand what that is before they're going to make a commitment to it. And so when we start looking at the review, one of there's several things in my view that need to be considered. One of them is that we do have an aging workforce, and that workforce is going to be replaced over time. And we have to give consideration to the commitment we're willing to make on right from education through at the early years, right through to the folks making choices about what industries they want to enter into. And so I think we need to think about what that looks like. Secondly, we really need to look at things such as the current workforce. Someone mentioned Hydro One. You know, how do you bring about a change management program in an industry where workers now have to think very differently about the way they go to work every day? You know, the line trade, the power line technician understands their industry very well. But in a smart grid world, it's a very different industry, and change management is going to be a mandatory requirement of that. We have to consider how are those things going to take place? When are they going to be implemented? We need to look at things like investment in workforce development. In the last 20 years, there's been no investment in training the line trade. And as a result of that, we talk about building transmission lines, but we have no workers to build them. And so when we're considering extending the system and introducing smart grid, smart network, we don't have a workforce currently in place that can actually make that a reality. So when we start looking at all of these items around what is it that we want the new sustainable energy system to do and look like, whether it's combined heat and power, or whether it's transmission, or whether it's grid control, we need to be really thoughtful as we're looking at creating this new environment. How are we going to develop the workforce that is going to be able to build the work that needs to be done? And with that, I'll leave it from there.
Joe. How many people in this room have already made some kind of a FIT submission for the FIT review? Okay. The rumblings I'm hearing is there's already 1,200 to 1,400 submissions being made by email. And from my experience, when you see that kind of numbers, that means that there are probably a lot of these from people that aren't sharing our views. And there are probably people that saying, keep the rates down, and perhaps the wind concerns people and that sort of thing too. So you may want to consider getting your comments in quickly, even if they aren't as sophisticated and complete as you might want, and make a second submission later on. Questions? We got one right here. Now you're going to have to be really loud.
I can yell, I think. Question perhaps for Barry. Can you tell me how much of the review that's contemplated now will result in an amendment, go in the direction of an amendment to the legislation versus the changing of regulations, and how much would have to actually go before the Parliament?
There's probably very little that would require changes. Oh, great, I can do that. With respect to the current FIT review, how much will require legislative change and how much can just be implemented? I would say probably almost all of the things that are of major concern can be changed with program rules. I think there's one area that we would require a legislative change, and that would be to empower the Ontario Energy Board to set delivery prices for heat and prices for, not necessarily prices for storage, but managing that. One of the problems that took place when Enbridge attempted to deliver what it had worked out with its change in undertakings to do ground source heat pumps was the Ontario Energy Board said, well, it didn't have the mandate legislatively to establish the delivery prices for heat. And obviously to do some of the things that we're talking about, whether it's solar thermal or ground source heat pumps, that will have to be taken care of. It's ironic that we can, an investor like Enbridge or Union Gas can put pipes in the ground to move fossil fuels around, but they can't put pipes in the ground to move solar thermal heat or ground source heat pumps, renewable.
Right here.
I have many people who are harping to me about the cost, the high cost of renewable energy. What we need is clear statements from several credible sources of what traditional energy sources would cost us. In other words, that we need to know what a coal-fired power plant would cost us. Not in terms of billions of dollars, but in terms of how many cents per kilowatt hour. Because that's what people out there understand. And when they understand that coal power plant is going to get 12 cents and nukes at 25 cents, then they'll realize that wind is not actually that expensive. But we need to have these numbers out there. And nobody is providing them.
Right.
It's going to cost $26 billion to put 2 nukes out there. And nobody understands what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was a statement more than a question, but it was sort of a call to action on saying that we need to know what the schedule is of real costs are for some of the alternative energy sources so that we can get legitimate comparisons and a legitimate debate. Is that fair, sir?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Jeff?
Jeff Olson, Energy Alliance. My question revolves around fitting local benefit community power into the OPA's review. Basically, I'd say some of the social friction that comes from both the cost of renewables, but also the lack of local benefit. So how can we get a framework where, similar to the Aboriginal program, where you can get a loan guarantee program for local benefit, and how can we get that put into is that part of the review, or is that some other policy?
Okay, what I think, I'm going to try the Reader's Digest version of that, and I think Jeff is saying, can we have a local social benefit adder paralleling the Aboriginal adder. Is that fair, Jeff?
What is the loan guarantee enabling the project, having a framework in place? We already have a community matter. We need something more so we can access the capital so that local communities can benefit rather than a community of people.
Okay. Anybody have any points on that?
I totally agree. And that, again, my suggestion about going back to our original asks by the Green Energy Act Alliance included those things. We got the community adder, but the reality is that communities in themselves and municipalities have actually been frustrated in trying to participate in any of those things.
Right. And John, just a second. John, I think you had a point to make.
It should. If you put it in, put that feedback in.
John?
Yeah, this isn't an idea that's originally with me, but I remember Mark Matson from Lake Ontario Waterkeeper talking about this, and he was, you may not like the analogy, but he likened this to a garbage dump. And if you live close to a garbage dump, it's acknowledged that it's not a good thing. It may devalue your property, so if you live right beside it, you get a certain payment, and if you live a little farther, you get a smaller payment until finally nobody does. And I know this, my family owns a cottage near Kincardine, and our local municipality gets a pittance, I think, hasn't reduced our property taxes because of the nuclear waste storage area at the Bruce Nuclear. So I'm not sure if there's some way. I mean, Mark talks about, when you put up a wind turbine, the only guy that gets any benefit from it is the property owner. And Mark talks about, well, is there some way of like the garbage dump, people in the surrounding areas getting some sort of a benefit. So I don't know if that's worth exploring during a fit review or not, that kind of mechanism.
Okay, we've got a question down here at the front.
And that was actually in what the Green Energy Act Alliance asked for originally.
Oh, thank you.
I'm from Northern Ontario. That's where as Marion said, we're all connected by extension cords. And we have tried over the last 10 years to get a number of large-scale renewable energy projects going, a couple of them which brought some very significant manufacturing opportunities. 500 jobs in a place like Sudbury is huge. And we had the developers line up their financing, bring in their technology partners, found excess capacity at the Hanmer TS, which for anybody who knows the connection points in Ontario is one of the majors. There were 600 megawatts of spare capacity, and Hydro One came in and said no. The OPA said nothing, and our local member of the legislature, who had backed the project to that point, went mum. Now you have a problem in southern Ontario with all the NIMBYs, and all the transmission capacity is being built down here. One thing Northern Ontario has is a lot of land that could support a lot of generating capacity, whether it be solar, wind, or whatever. But the oxymoron here is we've got land, but we can't connect. Down here, you've got no land, and you've got huge political problems, and they're running transmission lines all over the place. What can we do to change the thinking on the part of the provincial government to put some transmission capacity in places where there is an opportunity to generate cheap power?
I'm not going to try to summarize that, and seeing clapping at the back, you must have heard it, so I'll put it out to Byron. Maybe you have any comments on that? You're working on that capacity.
I think this is speaks to the point that I made earlier with respect to a fit review in absence of looking at transmission. I made a comment at the Water Power Association session last week, and I said, one of the worst things that could ever happen to capitalism is democracy, and we get into these situations where we lose perspective in terms of the greater good. I mean, we're all trying to service essentially a market in southern Ontario, and so long as all things being equal, you're able to align the stars and get everybody on side in the north with respect to generation and transmission initiatives, it all stops somewhere in Sudbury or Parry Sound, and trying to get the extension cord built between those two, I think, really requires a determined look at what needs to be done from a legislative perspective. And at some point in time, the demand for electricity in Southern Ontario is going to supersede that NIMBYism. It'll be a requirement